So both sides, let's just quickly review the highlights of what we said yesterday. We were trying to figure out why the Mishnah chooses to begin with Lulav as opposed to Esrog, when the pasuk itself begins Ulakachtem lachem b'yom harishon pri eitz hadar, which is the Esrog. So the Esrog is first on the list, and Kapos Tamarim is only second on the list. And we tried to suggest that maybe Lulav has a separate status because included in the word Lulav is 3 out of the 4 minim. And we proved that from a Gemara later on that says Lulav miyamin. And Lulav miyamin means that in the right hand he's holding 3 minim. And yet it says the word Lulav. So the word Lulav might mean 3 minim. But we rejected that immediately because as attractive as an answer as it is, it cannot hold water because Lulav in our Mishnah means Lulav and exclusively Lulav. It's not referring to neither the Hadassim nor the Aravos, which will be covered in subsequent Mishnayos in this very same chapter. So this Mishnah is totally exclusively focused on Lulav. We came up with a second approach that says that Lulav is given priority here because it is the tallest of all the minim. And we tried to explain what that might mean. It didn't seem to register with us that there's a special adifus, a special status to the mitzvah of Lulav simply because the Lulav towers above the others. And we spoke about the mitzvah of Nanuim. We spoke about the fact that a Lulav has to have an extra tefach in height above the other minim because of the mitzvah of Nanuim. We tried to connect Nanuim to Hallel, and maybe part of the mitzvah of Netilas Lulav is Hallel, and the Nanuim is the clincher that connects Lulav to Hallel. And therefore, Lulav, insofar as it has a special status in Nanuim, and we quoted the Pasuk Atzei Ayar, etc., therefore the Mishnah begins with Lulav. Now, we might ask the following question. The Mishnah is going to establish that not every Lulav, it's not like in democracy we say all men are equal in the eyes of the law. That's not so with regard to the minim of Lulav, and certainly not with the different types of Lulav that you can take. So the mitzvah of Lulav is conditional. And there are many different situations in which the Torah disqualifies the Lulav. For example, in our Mishnah, we're going to have a Lulav HaGazel, which literally means he stole a Lulav. Could you imagine? A man steals a Lulav in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav. And not only that, the Mishnah says that a Yavesh is possible, which means that even if he didn't steal the Lulav, he bought it, it's his, Kedasu Kedin. Nevertheless, if it's Yavesh, and we'll have to figure out what Yavesh means, the Lulav is possible. It no longer has the status of a Lulav. It's dried up. It's not connected, or it's not reminiscent of its original natural state. It's turned into basically a piece of wood, if you will. You could use it as a broomstick, but it's not a Lulav. And that's called ke'etz bi'alma. It's like a piece of wood. It's no longer a Lulav. And later on, we're going to have in the Mishnah cases where the Lulav is open or chopped off on top, and those two will be listed as psulei Lulav, as those cases where the Lulav is disqualified. And the question that we're going to have to ask eventually is there a common link here between all the different categories of psulei Lulav? And offhand, one might divide up the psulei Lulav into the following categories. One is a Lulav that's blemished, if you will. Physically, it's yavesh, it's dry. The head of the Lulav was cut off. The leaves of the Lulav are totally cut off or not connected. And those are psulim in gufo shel lulav, what we call in the physical change that took place in the lulav. Then we have another category of a lulav that physically it's identical to the natural lulav. It's beautiful. It's got all the dimensions of a lulav, but it was stolen. If I showed you two lulavim, one was stolen and one was bought and purchased kedasu kedin, you would not be able to know the difference between the two. They're identical. So we're no longer talking about a lulav that's pasul b'gufa. We're talking about some sort of extraneous external psul. And we'll see Rashi 3 lines down from the top. He says, "Gazul pasul ulakachtem lachem siv mishalachem." So again, we're not talking about the gufo shel lulav. Rashi is not describing the physical qualities or characteristics of this particular lulav. He's asking, do you have ownership over the lulav? The Torah requires ulakachtem lachem. How do we interpret the word lachem? Mishalachem. It's got to be your lulav. And if you don't have rightful monetary ownership over the lulav, Rashi says it's pasul, and you cannot use that lulav which you absconded, you stole from somebody else, for the mitzvah l'kachtem lachem, because it's not mishalachem. Again, the physical dimensions of the lulav, the external beauty of the lulav is identical to any other perfect lulav. It might be a beautiful lulav, but it's stolen, and therefore it's not lachem. Does everybody have that? Do you see clearly how that's a separate category of a psul that should not be equated with the case of yavesh? So we have 2 categories. The Mishnah is setting up a category called gazul, and that's lulav gazul, the name of our chapter, and that's because it's not what? Lachem. And then we have a lulav hayavesh, and yavesh is a problem with the gufo shel lulav. The physical lulav has turned into a piece of wood. It's no longer a lulav, and that's a transformation of the physicality of the lulav, and that's a separate category. We're going to see later on in the Mishnah that if the head of the lulav, the top of the lulav was cut off, chopped off, then that's also pasul. Once again, it's not the lulav that in its natural state grows on the tree. It's a psul in the gufo shel lulav. We're going to have another case in the Mishnah, if you take a look for a second. And again, we're not ready for all this yet, but I just want to set a framework. And that's called nifritzu olav, which means that the leaves of the lulav have completely separated from the shidra, from the spinal column of the lulav. Again, it's a malformed lulav, if you want to call it that. It's a psul begufo shel lulav. And that sets up a second category. Then we have a third category. Another lulav that's pasul, not because of the change in the gufo shel lulav, it's identical to any lulav, but not because it's not lachem, it's stolen and you don't have ownership, but because it came from a tree which is called an Asherah tree. And that's called in the language of the Mishnah, Lulav Shel Asherah. What is an Asherah? An Asherah is a tree that was worshipped back in the days of idolatry. There were certain beautiful trees and they worshipped the trees. And once the tree was worshipped, then you cannot use it for a lulav. That's a separate psul, a separate disqualification based on what? On avodah zarah. And we're going to see how we derive that avodah zarah and the lulav are mutually exclusive. So we have now 3 different categories. Let's review them. Number 1, we have psul begufo shel lulav, when the lulav changed and we called it malformed, if you will. It's not in its natural state. And we included under that many, many different subcategories like yavesh, which is like eitz bi'alma, and we have nifritzu olav, and we have niktam rosho. All of these are different manifestations of that same category called psul begufo. Then we have a psul that's external to the guf, which means that the lulav is identical to a perfect lulav, but it was stolen. And Rashi says that there's a precondition in the mitzvah of lulav of lachem mishalachem. And then we have a third category called avodah zarah, and that's called in the language of the Mishnah, Lulav shel Asherah. And for some reason, which we have to figure out, avodah zarah and the mitzvah of ulakachtem lachem are mutually exclusive. And that's a third category of a psul of lulav. Any questions so far?
Does Asherah have to be beautiful?
It could be beautiful.
Does it have to be?
No, it doesn't have to be beautiful. Yeah, but I'm just dramatizing the fact that there's no psul in the gufa shel lulav. It could be the most gorgeous lulav in the world. If you didn't know it was coming from an Asherah tree, you would pay 500 shekel for that lulav. Yeah, it's a beautiful lulav, but it's not a psul begufa shel lulav. It's a psul of avodah zarah. And now we take a look at Rashi. Lulav hagazel. Rashi says, Lulav, kaf shel tmorim. So Rashi is taking the terminology of the Mishnah and fitting it into the terminology of the Torah. The Torah doesn't call it a lulav. If you did a word search throughout the Torah for the word lulav, you'd end up with 0. So Rashi wants to know, okay, very nice, the Mishnah speaks about a lulav. Where's the Mishnah coming from? So Rashi opens up the pasuk, and we have the pasuk that we read in Vayikra Chav Gimel Parshas Zevul Lekachtem Lachem B'Yom HaRishon Pri Eitz Hadar, which we said was an esrog, and then it says Kapos Tmorim. Now notice that the term Kapos Tmorim is not in the singular, but rather in the plural. But the word lulav in our Mishnah, by contrast, is in the singular. So Rashi has to give us a little bit more than just simply quoting the language of the Torah, because if he would quote the language of the Torah, there would be a certain discrepancy between the language of the Torah and the language of the Mishnah. What would be the discrepancy? The language of the Torah is in what? In the grammatical plural, and the language of the Mishnah is in the grammatical singular. Of course, the Torah uses the term kapos tmorim, whereas the Mishnah uses the word lulav, which is only one lulav. So Rashi, therefore, when he rewrites the pasuk, so to speak, he writes it in a way that it would fit into the Mishnah in using a singular grammatical form. So he takes the kapos tmorim, and instead he calls it kaf shel tmorim. He doesn't do an injustice to the pasuk because kapos tmorim is just one kaf shel tmorim with another kaf shel tmorim. And the Torah uses the plural in describing the lulav as kapos tmorim. But for our Mishnah, all we need is kaf shel tmorim. Now Rashi addresses a different question. Okay, but the pasuk in kapos tmorim continues. It doesn't just end there, and it says va'anaf eitz avos. That's what we call hadassah, and then it says v'yarve nacha, which is what we call aravos. So Rashi says, don't make any mistake. Don't think that the word lulav here refers to hadassim and aravos. Don't think that the Mishnah means lulav, etc. Kapos tmorim, and all that comes after kapos tmorim in the pasuk, which would be arvei nochal, and what else does it say there? and anafetz avos. No. Rashi says v'hadar tani hadas v'arava bi'ape nafshai. Later on, in a subsequent Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, is going to address the cases of hadas and aravos. Different laws, and they're not included under this Mishnah. So this Mishnah is focused exclusively on the kaf shel tmar. You want to know what dinim and psulim that are enumerated here with regard to the lulav will apply elsewhere in the pasuk with regard to hadasim and aravos? Hadar tani. Hadar tani means it's coming up down the line. Be patient, but it's not here in this Mishnah. And we may find very well that some of the disqualifications that apply to lulav do not apply to hadasim and aravos. We have to wait until we get to those mishnayos and research those mishnayos until we can determine what is common between a lulav and hadasim and aravos, which psulim apply to both and which do not apply to both. Then Rashi gets to Gaza. And we saw this Rashi, and therefore we can skip to Yavesh. Yavesh, de be'inon mitzvah mehuderes. What is Rashi saying over here? Be'inon, we require a mitzvah muderes. Is that some sort of general requirement that applies to every single mitzvah? Maybe if you had spoken about a matzah yavesha, you would say be'inon mitzvah muderes. Or maybe in a shofar, be'inon shofar mehudar. Tzitzis, tefillin. We can go on and on and on. Or is Rashi referring to something specific that applies to a lulav, and then we'll see if it applies to hadasim and aravos, to be'inon mehuderes. Which word that Rashi uses indicates that he's talking about some sort of universal halacha that applies to all mitzvahs, and he's simply applying it in this particular case. Which word? You can unmute yourself. Muderet might be a general halacha, or it might be a specific halacha. But what word did Rashi add here?
Mitzvah.
Mitzvah. Excellent. Who said it? Ruvain? Was that you, Ruvain?
Yes.
Thank you, Ruvain.
Yes.
I owe you one. Mitzvah, the word mitzvah. Why did Rashi add the word mitzvah? Rashi should have said, the be'inon mehuderes. We need mehuderes. But no, Rashi says be'inon mitzvah mehuderes. He's stretching his arm out to a universal principle that applies to all mitzvahs. And that is the be'inon mitzvah mehuderes. And the clincher is the next two words in Rashi. I'll prove it to you. Dichsiv. What's the next word, everybody? Ve'anveu. Ve'anveu means I will glorify you, God. That pasuk, ve'anveu, does not appear in the parsha of Lulav. Where does it appear, Abosai? Right, okay, good. Shmot Tetva. But in what context? It's part of a greater piece, which we know of, that's called the Shiras Hayam. Right? Oz Yosher Moshe ben Israel, Ze Keli Anveu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. And Chazal say, it's a Gemara at the end of Masechet Shabbos, that Vanveu means mitzvah muderes, which is, as we call it in our language, hidur mitzvah. Rashi says that every mitzvah requires hidur mitzvah, whether it be a talis, a tzitzis, a mezuzah, or matzah, or a shofar, or a lulav. And in our context, we need vanvehu. And what is the opposite of vanvehu in the case of lulav? Which lulav is completely excluded under vanvehu? You can't glorify God with the hidur of this lulav. That's called the lulav hayavesh. You got it. Dov has it. Okay, Dov, you can take over now.
I don't think so.
No? Yavesh.
No, so other mitzvahs also, if it's not Muhuda, it's possible.
Yaakov, you're asking a brilliant question.
Brilliant.
I'll prove to you it's brilliant.
Okay.
Because probably 1,000 years ago, that question on Rashi was raised by whom? By Tosfos. So you're going back to a time machine 1,000 years. I may be exaggerating. Maybe it's 900 years. Back to the 1200s.
That's such an obvious question.
Zek Kelevi Avehu is a very nice thing. I don't know if you have to spend 1,000 shekel on an esrog, right? But it's very nice to get a beautiful matzah, a beautiful esrog, a beautiful pair of tzitzis, a beautiful pair of tefillin, a mezuzah. It's all nice. It's all good. A Sefer Torah should be beautiful. You write a Sefer Torah if the sofer is very artistic, and if he's very pious, so he has right kavanas when he writes a Sefer Torah, he can create a Sefer Torah that is Zek Kelevi Avehu. I could glorify God. But what happens if I buy a second-rate lulav, a second-rate mezuzah? You know, you could spend 1,000 shekel on mezuzah. You could buy a mezuzah for 50 shekel. And that's true for every single mitzvah. Shall we say that since you don't have a mitzvah muderes, that disqualifies the mitzvah? And you don't fulfill the mitzvah?
No, but it's a relative thing. You can have muderet a little bit, muderet a lot, muderet.
Excellent. Good. So right now,
No, but I'm asking, let's say mezuzah
Right.
is totally free of any hidu.
right. So maybe according to Rashi, it would be possible.
Because
But I would suggest that we take that up as a separate topic, maybe tomorrow. I don't know if we're here tomorrow, we're not here tomorrow. And we'll take that under advisement. You know, what would be if you had a mezuzah or a shofar or a piece of matzah that was like, you know, really bad? You know, would that be possible? Rashi would seem to indicate that it would be possible.
so this is in the first one.
So Rashi says, Tichsiv v'anvehu. The Torah says v'anvehu. And again, where does the Torah say v'anvehu? In the parasha of Shira. And the Gemara derives from v'anvehu, hidur mitzvah, that we should always be mahadar the mitzvah. There's even a sugya bava kama, how much money we should spend for hidur mitzvah. And that's called shlish. We should add an extra third of the price in order to make it a mitzvah muderes. And then the Gemara is a machlokas, exactly what that means, a third of the price, how to calculate a third of the price. All of that is fine. So again, let's just summarize. We saw three very important points in Rashi. Point number one is that the lulav of our Mishnah only refers to lulav. And as far as the other, let's say, buddies of the lulav that usually accompany the lulav, that's hadas and ravos, that will take up separately later on in the Mishnah. The second point in Rashi is that a lulav hagazel is possible because the Torah says lachem. And how do we interpret lachem? Mishel lachem. And you don't own this lulav because you stole it. And therefore, you're not yotze with the lulav, it's not lachem. And finally, Rashi tells us that yavesh is possible because of zek keli v'anvehu. V'anvehu means that you need a mitzvah mehuderes. And yavesh is anything but a mitzvah mehuderes. I want to focus our attention now on the case of gazel for a minute, a stolen lulav. Rashi says that be'inan lachem, mishal lachem, correct? So you have to own the lulav because the Torah says l'kachtem lachem. If you steal the lulav, it's not yours, you can't be yotze. Why? You're good, though.
You find one. You find one. You find one.
It's hefker. You mean.
Yes, FK.
Yeah, usually, I'm going to reformulate your question, but usually when you find something that's hefker, the very moment you pick it up, it becomes yours. So if he's shaking the lulav or he's picking up the lulav, it's his lulav.
So it's Mishalachem.
So it's mishalachem.
Okay.
But I want to reformulate your question. What about a case where I borrow a lulav? Whose lulav is it? Reuven gives me a lulav and he says, Rabbi Berzon, you can use my lulav. I lend it to you. I didn't steal it. It's his, it's not mine. So my question is, why put all this emphasis on guzzle if Rashi says that guzzle is simply the lack of bailus, I don't own it, it's not lochem, then why focus on the negative, on the guzzle? Why not just tell me that a lulav hasha'ul is possible? And shaul, I think, would be a more, shall we say, inclusive
Not
category.
Not possible.
Why not?
Because it's not, this is the psul. Gazul is a psul.
Well, why isn't shaul possible for the very same reason that guzzle is possible?
Why should it be possible?
Because the Torah says lachem,
No,
it's not mine.
you're not Yotze. If I steal a lulav,
Well, again, the owner of the lulav that was stolen
uh,
can use the lulav. It's a kosher lulav.
you can.
Absolutely. There's no psul in the lulav. Again, as we said it before, the gufa shel lulav is identical.
It's king in Zayah.
Oh, so then I don't understand Rashi at all. Rashi is assuming that there is no kinyan on the part of the gazlan. I mean, there are cases in Gemara Bava
No,
Kama,
it's not possession, but there's a king.
but I'm just saying, lochem means you have to have a kinyan on it. And there are cases where a gazlan could create a kinyan, but not that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a case where the lulav, there was no shinu in the lulav, he didn't change the lulav, and there was no yeush or whatever. Again, we'll have to go through the whole sugya in Bava Kama and learn the Hilchos Gzela, which takes up about half of the Masechta there in Bava Kama. But Rashi's telling us that it's not your lulav. Again, the owner of the lulav can certainly use the lulav. In fact, he could probably even steal the lulav back, sneak into the guy's house and steal it back, and he could be yotze the mitzvah. But if that be the case, if we take Rashi as a psul of what? Lagabi, the person who doesn't own it, a relative psul, relative to him, because it's not mishalachem, he cannot use it as a mitzvah l'kachtem lachem, then the same thing should apply to shaul, which is a borrowed lulav. And I think shaul, you have to grant me, would be a more encompassing psul. In other words, don't think, if the Mishnah had used the word shaul, don't think that, this is possible because he did something illegal. He absconded with someone else's lulav. No. It's possible because it's not lachem.
Yeah.
It could be that he did everything on the up and up, but it's not lachem, and therefore he's not yotze.
You have space to say, well, why? What's the reason that Reuven is lending Rabbi Berzon the lulav? Maybe Rabbi Berzon couldn't afford it or didn't have
Right.
content. So that shouldn't. No, does that disqualify?
Sure.
you?
If it's not lachem, unless he gives me a kinyan, he could say, this lulav is yours. And now I make a kinyan, I pick it up, it's metaltal in his
Yeah.
kinyan adva, and then I could be yotze. But what about shaul, where I lend you my lulav and I'm not willing to, bequeath you the lulav and transfer ownership to you in the lulav? That should be mentioned somewhere in the Mishnah.
There was a
According to
time
Rashi.
maybe I forgot my lulav. I forgot it. And you're lending it to me for that time. Because I know it's not mine, and I know it's not going to keep it, but to be able to make the brachot and be able to participate.
Rashi says no.
When Rashi.
Machlok Shlik Tov and Rashi. Because Rashi's saying that it's got to be lachem. Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to fight it out here. I'm going to represent Rashi, but again, you're stronger than I am.
Maybe if it's a kazoo, then it's possible to other people as well.
I don't think so. Again, are those other people owners of the lulav or they're not owners of the
No,
lulav? Again, in Shol, we're going to ask who owns the lulav. In Guzzle, we're going to ask who owns the lulav. Rashi says that there's only one critical factor here. Who owns the lulav? And if that be the case, then Shol would supply the psul just like Guzzle would. There's no superior, how should I say, position to Guzzle over Shol. They're identical. In both cases, you don't have ownership over the Lulav. I mean, Dov asked about Hefker. So my assumption was, in answering his question, that the moment he picks up the Lulav, he's Zochim and a Hefker, and therefore it's Lachem. But in the case...
That is possible because he doesn't have permission to have it. But Shol, he has permission to have it in his position. The owner,
Correct.
yes, you can have it. You can
Again, but
yes.
it's not
But
yours.
Agadul, it's not. He doesn't have permission of the owner.
Right. But you're putting it into a moral context, meaning, the fact that the Gazla, took over the possession immorally, he violated a terrible Avera, so therefore we can disqualify his mitzvah. But in terms of Bailus, whether you have permission or you don't have permission, I mean, that's relevant to, as I said, the moral realm of whether he violated Avera in taking this Lulav, but it's not relevant to Bailus. A Shoel does not own the Lulav, period. That's the end of the story. A Shoel is borrowing it on a temporary basis. He doesn't have ownership of it. For example, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but there's a famous Shach. The Shach asks the question, according to many Rishonim, matzah also requires lachem. That means that I could be Yotze the mitzvah matzah only if I own the matzah. So the Shach asks the question, if I invite someone to my Seder, he's going to be eating my matzah. How is he Yotze the mitzvah matzah with my matzah? And the Shach has to do somersaults in the air. And he says that the very fact that he gave me the matzah to eat, consumption of the matzah is itself a flagship of violence. The fact that I can eat the matzah and I'll never return it to him means that he gave me kinyanim on the matzah. And the Nesivus gets up and he argues, but how can he give you ownership on the matzah on the night of Pesach? We have a law that says you're not allowed to bequeath ownership and transfer ownership on Yontif. There's an Isur lahaknos b'Yontif. D'Rabbanan. But again, I'm just giving you a flavor of this whole business here about ownership.
Who's the one who says that originally that matzah also has a question of?
I think most of the Rishonim do, because there's a pasuk that says matzaschem, which implies that you have to own the matzah. Again, I'm not getting off on a tangent. We're not learning Pesachim right now. For that, you have to come to my 9:00 class. But what we're learning now is about Lulav, and Shol is actually puzzle in Lulav. So why doesn't the Mishnah mention Shol? So I want to share with you an insight which appears in many, many different Sfarim. It's in the Aruch LaNer, and it's in the Pnei Yoshua, many, many different Sfarim. They claim that when we look at Lulav Hayavesh, and the Mishnah says that Lulav Hayavesh is possible, that means that it's possible all 7 days, or in Chutzlar, it's 8 days of Yontif. Shol is only possible on the first day of Yontif. So when the Mishnah mentions Gazul and Yavesh in the same breath as possible, the Mishnah wants to convey the message that possible means throughout the entire Yontif. Why would I entertain the idea that maybe it's only possible on the first day and not the other days of Yontif? So that has to do with what we call a distinction between D'Oraisas and D'Rabbanan. The Torah commands me in the mitzvah of Lulav on which day? Only on the first day. L'kachtem lachem bayom harishon. There's another mitzvah that appears in the pasuk, but only applies to the Beis HaMikdash. And again, we're going to have a lot to talk about this as we go along. But suffice it to say that we take the Lulav in the Beis HaMikdash all 7 days. Today, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. So we have what's called a Zecher LeMikdash. So to remember the Mikdash, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai made a takana that we take the Lulav for 7 full days. Lulav, I thought I heard somebody speak. Okay. So we take the Lulav for 7 days, but that's only D'Rabbanan. And with regard to Psulei Lulav, one of the main topics of our parak is going to be When you have a mitzvah doraisa, then we're going to be machmir, and in that strict sense, we're going to make certain things possible. But when you're only dealing with the rest of Yontif, where the mitzvah of Lulav is only the Rabbanan, then we could be more lenient. We could be makil, and certain psulim that apply in the first day will not apply on the rest of the days. And one of the examples of that is Shaul. So on the second day of Yontif here in Eretz Yisrael, I could borrow your Lulav and I could be Yotzei. But on the first day of Yontif, I cannot borrow your Lulav because the Torah says Lachem. But the psul of Lachem only applies to the first day of Yontif. The psul of Yavesh, as we said before, applies throughout the entire Yontif, even when it's the Rabbanan. And now we understand why Gazul is mentioned in our Mishnah. Because Gazul is puzzle all 7 days. And that's why it fits together like a glove together with Yavesh. The Mishnah avoided Shaul, even though Shaul would be puzzle, because Shaul would only be puzzle, it's limited. To which day would it be puzzle? Only the first day. But Gazul is puzzle all 7 days. And we have to understand why. But let's accept it right now as a given. The Gemara is going to go through this back and forth with the Shakla V'Tarya. If you take a look, for example, we'll just, again, we're not ready for the Gemara yet, but just to read it very quickly, superficially. Kapasik V'Tani, the Mishnah did not qualify. It just says pasul. And the word pasul is called Kapasik V'Tani. Again, we'll have a lot to talk about that, but suffice it to say that the word pasul means straight across the board, without any qualification. What does that mean? Lo shna b'yontif rishon. It matters not when we're on the first day of yontif. Lo shna b'yontif sheni, or again in Eretz Yisrael on the second day of yontif. The second day of yontif is only the Rabbanan, and yet the Mishnah used the word pasul, kapasik v'tani, indicating that it's pasul straight across the board for all 7 days. Bishlemi Yavesh says the Gemara, I understand why Yavesh is pasul all 7 days. Why? Because Hadar be'inun v'leka. We need something, Rashi would say a mitzvah muderes, if you know what I mean. And we don't have a mitzvah muderes. You've basically changed, you've altered the essence of the law. Can I ask you to put yourself on mute for a minute? So I understand very well why Yavesh Kapasik V'Tani is puzzle all 7 days. It's not a Ela Gazel. I don't know exactly. Can I do this? Yeah, maybe I can put him in mute here.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, I think it worked. Okay then. So where am I? Ela Gazel. Bishlei b'yontif rishon. I understand why we disqualify a stolen lulav on the first day of yontif tichsiv lachem. And what does lachem mean? Mishal lachem, as we saw in the Rashi at the beginning of the parak. El b'yontif sheni. With regard to yontif sheni, we don't require ownership of the lulav, and that's why Shaul, as I said before, would be kosher during the balance of yontif. Rab Yochanan Mishum Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, and here we have the famous principle, which is formulated by Rab Yochanan on Daf Lamed, Mishum Dahavile Mitzvah Abba Avera. A mitzvah that came through an Avera is pasul, and that psul applies, as we'll see, according to Rab Yochanan, both with regard to a mitzvah doraisa and with regard to a mitzvah dirabanan. So that even though the balance of Yontif, which is called in the Gemara's language Yontif Sheni, is only D'Rabbana, nevertheless the psul of Mitzvah Baba Avera applies to Yontif Sheni, to the Rabbanans as well. And now we have an answer to our original question. Why did the Mishnah focus on Gazul and not on Shaul? The identical reason that pasels a Lulav at Gazul, disqualifies a Lulav ha Shaul, because in both cases we need ownership and leka. He doesn't have lachem. But the answer is the Mishnah here is focused on what kind of psulim? Not on psulim of Yontif Rishon, but on psulim that apply even to Yontif Sheni, the entire balance, even though it's only D'Rabbanan. And we understand that Yavesh, because it's not Hadar, therefore it's Pasal Kol Shiva. The identity of the Lulav has been undermined. And that's for all 7 days. But in the case of Shaul, that's only a psul on Yontif Rishon, because the Torah requires a lekach. And it's got to be lachem, mishalachem. The rest of the Yontif, we don't require lachem, mishalachem. But Gazel is possible all 7 days, not because of lachem, but because of mitzvah abba b'avir. And Rashi in our Mishnah is misleading us deliberately. And when he tells me that the psul of Gazel is because of lekachtem lachem, he is tripping us up because he wants us to fall into a trap. That's always the style of Rashi. Whenever Rashi interprets the Mishnah, he interprets the Mishnah in the light of the Havamina, the original understanding of the Gemara. What was the Havamina? Why is Lulav HaGazel possible in the Havamina? Because we need lachem mishalachem.
How do we know that that's the Havamina?
That's what the Gemara says over here. Take a look. The Gemara says, El Gazel, Bishlemi Yontif Rishon. I understand why the Gazel is possible, because it says lachem mishalachem. So the Gemara understands that Gazel is possibly din shalachem, but the Gemara says if that be the case, then like Shaul, it should only be possible on the first day. And we say kapasik v'tani, that the Mishnah is talking about psulim that apply straight throughout the entire balance of Yontif. So the Gemara answers, you made a mistake. Your Havamina is being rejected. The psul of Lulav HaGazel is not because of lachem. That would apply to Shaul. And then it would be limited to which day of Yontif? The first day of Yontif. But rather the psul of Gazel is what? Everybody. Mitzvah Abba B'Avera. And the psul of Mitzvah Abba B'Avera, like the psul of Yavesh, applies throughout all of Yontif. And this is the derech of Rashi. Rashi always gives us in the Mishnah the initial understanding of the laws of the Mishnah so that we'll understand the Gemara. And the Gemara is telling us that you think, and that's our impression, that Lulav HaGazel is possible because Shalachem and it's not yours. Well, if that be the case, then it doesn't fit with the Mishnah of Yavesh, Kapasik Vitani, Loshna Yontif Rishon, Loshna Yontif Sheni, and the psul of Lachem only applies to Yontif Rishon and not to Yontif Sheni. But the psul of Lulav is not lachem. And as Yaakov said, maybe he has kinyonim in the Lulav after he steals it. I don't know. Maybe there's Yeush. Maybe there's Shini Rishus, Shini Hashem. I don't know what. But kinyonim won't help him. Because how did he obtain that Lulav? Ba'avera. And that's called mitzvah ba'avera. That is a psul that disqualifies a mitzvah baba affair throughout, whether it's mitzvahs d'oraisa, mitzvahs d'arbana, whether it's the first day of Yontif or the entire balance. So b'li neder, when we get more into the sugya, we're going to have to try to figure out why is it that the psul of lachem only applies to the first day and not to the rest of the days, whereas the psul of hadar, like in the case of Lulav HaYavesh, the Gemara assumes without even questioning, without even blinking an eye, that psul applies straight throughout the entire Yontif. And that has to do with the categorization that we spoke about at the beginning of today's discussion between a psul begufo shel Lulav as opposed to a psul that's external to the Lulav, like the case of lachem. Okay then, so let me wish everyone a great day, and thank you so much for being with me, and Mirz Hashem, we should be together for many happy occasions to learn Teres Hashem.